Hi, everyone. We'll get started in just a minute or so. We're going to give people a little bit more time to log in, and we are transferring the workgroup members from regular attendee status to panelists so they are able to unmute themselves and participate in the discussion. So we'll get started in just another minute or so. All right, folks, I think we will go ahead and get started. There might be some more people logging in over these first few minutes, but we might as well get things moving since we do have limited time this morning. Thank you all for joining us. Good morning to everyone. I think we have someone also joining us where it is evening, so good evening to you, at least one person. Thank you all for joining us today. We are kicking off with the first workgroup meeting for the development of our biochar protocol. We are very excited about it. My name is John Remicall. I'm the Associate Director for Nature-Based Solutions at the Climate Action Reserve. And the first thing I want to do is to start by thanking all of the workgroup members. Your participation in this process is really critical to the ultimate success of the protocol. So we really appreciate your commitment to this process and providing your feedback. Next, I want to get into just the purpose of this meeting, and that is to really get the work group familiar with the process for developing protocols at the reserve and what we typically like to include in our protocols. We want to then solicit feedback on a number of considerations that we are looking at for this protocol in particular. And all of this at the end of the day is intended to help provide a roadmap for the drafting of the protocol, which will be taking place over the next several months. Just a few housekeeping matters. All the workgroup members have the opportunity to participate throughout the meeting. We ask that you keep yourselves muted unless you're going to be speaking. If you'd like to be on camera, that would be terrific. That will likely help facilitate some of the discussions that we'll have if we're able to see each other, but obviously it's optional if you don't want to, but just please do speak up if you do have something to say at any point. We'll be asking and taking questions throughout the session. Anyone who is not a workgroup member who is attending today is in listen-in mode. You're able to submit questions into the question box in GoToWebinar. And we will try to answer those questions as time allows, but the priority here is the workgroup discussion. So we might not be able to get to all of the questions that any observers are sending in. And then lastly, we will have all the slides from today, as well as a recording of the presentation posted to our website. And just a quick look at the agenda for today. We'll start out with just some quick introductions, and then we'll go over the process that we're looking at for the development of this protocol. We'll do kind of like a high-level overview of the approach we're looking at for this protocol, and then we'll get into some of the details around specific components of the protocol that we're looking at. And there'll be quite a bit of discussion. That's the main part of the discussion today. And then lastly, we'll have just kind of an open discussion at the end if time allows, and if there are any topics that anyone wants to raise in particular at that point. And then we'll wrap up with next steps in the process. All right, so now we'll start out with some introductions, and I'm actually going to pass it over to Craig Ebert, the president of the Reserve, to say a few words first. Craig?
Well, thanks, John. I appreciate it. And just to be clear, did you want to go introductions of the entire work group before we move on, or should I just make comments? We'll come back to introductions.
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and make comments, and we'll come back and do the work group introductions.
Well, thanks, everybody. Really appreciate all of you participating today. On behalf of the Climate Action Reserve and our board of directors, we think this is a really critical effort that all of us are collectively undertaking today. And it's very appropriate that this meeting is kicking off during the first week of COP26 in Glasgow, Scotland. For those of you who've been following the press over there, there's definitely a heightened sense of urgency around the climate crisis. It's an understatement to say that that's perhaps too little, too late. For those of us who have been working in this space for a long time, it's critically important that humanity unlock all of its potential tools for addressing the climate crisis. And frankly, the biochar protocol is one key aspect of a nature-based solution strategy. So again, appreciate all of you joining us today. For those of you not familiar with the Reserve, our mission is simply stated there at the top, that our goal is to develop, promote, and support innovative, credible, market-based climate change solutions that benefit economies, ecosystems, and society. Cut to the chase, we need to solve this climate crisis as soon as possible. We firmly believe it's within our grasp, but it takes the collective will of all of us to make it happen. We were originally created by an act of the California legislature back in 2001 as the California Climate Action Registry. We are now an independent nonprofit and work with our sister organization, the Climate Registry, on a variety of matters. And one of our collective goals here at the Reserve is to make sure that we bring the highest quality offset protocols to market. We feel like the service model that we bring is superior to the work that's being done by many other efforts around the world. And part of it is the process all of you are involved in today. We pride ourselves on a very transparent, integrated process where anyone who's interested can participate in the process from day one until the end of the process. And that transparency and public-facing nature of this work, we think, is critically important. For all of you out there, whether you're believe or a proponent of biochar or not, our goal is to make sure that we've got a protocol at the end of the day that is as grounded in science as possible and is ready for market uptake. In that capacity, we've already been developing many protocols over the years, including serving as the project registry in California, helping to serve their cap and trade market. For those of you familiar with the California market, the California Air Resources Board has adopted 6 offset protocols, and 5 or 5.5 of those were developed here at the Reserve. So we're very proud of that fact. We currently operate across North America and occasionally in other countries as well. And again, I welcome all of you to the table today. John, you want to go to the next slide? This is just a map that lays out the different types of offset projects that we have spread around North America. I'll let each of you, look at the key and draw your own conclusions. But obviously, it's a very geographically diverse and emission pathway diverse set of protocols. As I said just a few moments ago, we're focused on bringing protocols to market that can make a fundamental difference in this climate problem. And we think today's discussion is going to fit very nicely into that. And just one last thing I wanted to mention. I'm actually heading off to Glasgow, Scotland later on today for the second week of COP. To indicate just the importance, I think, that's finally getting traction. And I hope this is not another feint. This is our 26th COP. My first one was Kyoto, the COP3 in '97. We're privileged to host the largest U.S. subnational delegation to COP ever. We have, I believe it's 8 governors and 14 states now attending, a delegation approaching 200 people, have our own pavilion over there. I mention that only because it's indicative of the keen level of interest that, it's better late than never that folks are getting traction. So we hope that there's a lot of positive takeaways from COP26, but forgive me for my skepticism if we're heading into the 26th version and wondering why we haven't solved this problem yet. But that's for a discussion for another day. I'm going to turn it back to John and thank all of you for attending.
Great, thanks, Craig. So now I wanted to do just some quick introductions for the people on our side of things who are going to be working on this protocol. So again, I'm John Remicall. I'm the Associate Director for Nature-Based Solutions at the Reserve. I'm going to be leading the development of the protocol for the Reserve. And we have a few other folks involved as well. And I'll ask them just to say a quick hello. Heather, if you'd like to say hello.
Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you. Thanks for joining the Biochar Workgroup. You'll be seeing me messaging you off and on during Workgroup meetings. So don't be surprised if you see my name pop up in a chat box. So good morning.
Yeah, and that reminds me too, if there's anyone on the Workgroup who has not been switched over to a panelist at this point, please reach out via the questions box, I guess that would be, so we can make sure you get switched over. But I think it looked like about everyone was switched over at this point. Next, we have Holly Davison. Holly, if you'd like to say hello, please.
Sure, thanks, John. Hi, everyone. My name is Holly Davison. I'm the Associate Director of Programs at the Reserve. I lead the Industrial Processes and Gases Sector team, and I also support the Forest team, and I'm very excited to support this work and to work with all of you. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Holly. And then we have Marissa Schmitz. Marissa, would you like to say hello, please?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. I'm Marissa Schmitz, and I'm the Forestry Manager at the Reserve, and I work on protocol efforts related to forestry, and I'm happy to be a part of this effort.
Great, thanks, Marissa. And then lastly, we have John Nickerson, who's not on staff at the Reserve, but has been in the past and works very closely with the Reserve as a consultant. And as some of you may know, he is the lead or co-author on a handful of our protocols. So he's very well versed in how we do things at the Reserve and what our expectations are for protocols. And next we'll get into the work group introductions. And as I mentioned over email, rather than having everyone introduce themselves more thoroughly, I think we'll just have you each say hello, and we'll just kind of go in alphabetical order by first name today. And this will give us an opportunity to test out your audio to make sure you're able to unmute yourself and say hello. So why don't we start out here with Akio?
Well, hello, everybody. Isn't that nice being on the top of the list?
Great, thanks, Akio. Can move on to Allison.
Hi, glad to be here. Josiah, good to see you. It's been a while.
Great. And Bruce, are you here? I think I saw your name on the list. Might not be switched over yet.
Yes, I'm here, John. Morning.
Oh,
can you hear me?
Great. Yep.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Bruce. And Dan, would you like to say hello?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. I'm Dan Sanchez from UC Berkeley. Looking forward to this.
Great. Next we have David.
Yes, good morning, everyone from Sonoma, California, where we finally have some rain after many months of lack thereof.
Great. And Hannes?
Yes, hello everyone. I'm one of the honored persons who is joining on the evenings from Cologne, Germany at the moment. So hi, excited to be here. I'm working with Southwell at the moment.
Great. And Jeff?
Hi, I think my mic is unmuted, but yes, okay, great. So anyhow, Jeff Cole, General Manager for Nature-Based Solutions at Shell, and really cool to reconnect with a whole bunch of old faces or people I've heard a lot about through 1 degree of separation over the years. So nice to be here. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jeff. Johannes?
Hello, this is Johannes Lehmann, a soil scientist at Cornell University. I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks. And Jonah?
Hi, good morning, Jonah.
And John?
Hi everyone, John Alcock at Resco Solutions. Nice to meet you all.
And continuing on, we have Josiah.
Hello, Josiah Hunt here, CEO Pacific Biochar. Excited to be in this group with you guys.
Thanks, Josiah. Next we have Kevin.
Hi everyone, Kevin Fingerman, in from the far north of California, Humboldt State University.
Thank you, Kevin. And let's see, Matt was not able to attend today, but he asked his colleague Jessica to fill his shoes in for him today. So Jess, if you'd like to say hello. Oh, we're not able to hear you, Jess. Hold on. Let's see if we can unmute you.
She should be unmuted, so I think it's on her end.
Okay. Might have to have you troubleshoot a little bit, Jess, and see if you can get your audio to work. Maybe we can come back at the end of the list and just see if you're having any better luck at that point. Next, we have Melissa.
Hi, everyone. Know a couple of you and looking forward to meet more.
Thanks, Melissa. And next, we have Micah.
Hey everybody, Micah from UC Berkeley and Blue Forest Conservation. Nice to be here. Excited to work with you all.
Thanks, Micah. Next we have Nate.
Hi everybody, very glad to be here. Thanks for having me. And Jess, if you're troubleshooting your audio, I had to close out and then rejoin, and it seemed to solve my problems. Good luck.
Thanks for the tip, Nate. Appreciate it. Next we have Patricio.
Hey guys, nice to meet you. It's Patricio Ortiz from ACT Commodities, and very excited to work with you guys.
Thanks, Patricio. Next we have Phil.
Morning, folks. Phil with Blue Forest, and echoing David's appreciation of some wet weather here in California.
Great. And then we have Rachel as well.
Hi, everyone. Calling in from DC and representing Woodwell Climate Research Center.
Thanks for joining us, Rachel. Then we have Sean.
Yeah, good morning. This is Sean McMahon with with Astra Global Solutions. We're verifiers of carbon offset projects. Very glad to be a part.
Thanks, Sean. And then we have Tristan. Is Tristan on today? Maybe not yet, huh?
Yep, I don't see his name yet.
Yeah, okay. I thought he was going to be joining, so maybe he'll just be late. Jess, are you having any luck at this point with the audio? Doesn't appear, so okay. I guess if you continue to have any problems, you could either try calling in with the phone number, or if you have any comments, you can always submit them via the chat, and we can make sure we bring those into the conversation, or any comments that you have. Sorry that you're having trouble though. Okay, moving on then. Thanks for saying hello, everyone, and testing out your mic. I'm glad that at least almost all of us are able to connect via audio. Next, I wanted to just acknowledge the funding support that we have for this work. So we have two different grants that are supporting directly the development of the protocol. One is from the U.S. Forest Service through their Wood Innovations Program. We are very grateful for their support, and another from CAL FIRE, the Department of Forestry and Fire Protection in California, through a forest health grant. And that funding is also supporting the development of a companion market analysis that is being performed by Micah and Phil and Dan, who are all on the work group. And then we also have funding support for some pilot projects. And we have Josiah and Jonah who are bringing in some pilot projects, and we're also trying to track down a couple of additional pilot projects to participate in this process as well. So now just to go, I'll try to move quickly through the process so we can actually get to the main part of the discussion. So again, what we're trying to do is develop a protocol that is robust as possible to account for the greenhouse gas impacts of biochar, so we can issue climate reserve tons, or CRTs is the name of our offset credits, to projects. We have a set of criteria that we use and a set of principles that we apply when we are developing our protocols, and we'll be applying those as we're developing this protocol. And we'd like to really take advantage of a lot of the knowledge that is out there from just technologies that are being developed, other protocols that have been or are being developed, as well as other programs and standards out there. It seems like there's been a lot of work done around biochar, and so we're hoping to bring in a lot of that knowledge to our effort here. And then lastly, as I mentioned before, a really key part of this process is getting feedback from experts like you all. And so hopefully we have teed things up well enough here to get really good feedback, so we have a good plan of attack for how we're going to actually write the protocol in the next few months. Just to really quickly highlight the main components that we look at with our protocols. We're going to go into some more detail on these coming up here in a few minutes, but I just wanted to at least kind of set the stage here with this. So one of the main components is looking at eligibility for projects, and that's looking at project definitions, who can actually own a project, when a project is started and what the crediting period is, how long they're able to have credits issued essentially, where projects can be located, additionality, which is really critical to make sure that we are crediting for actions that wouldn't otherwise have taken place under business as usual conditions. We want to make sure that projects are complying with all relevant laws and regulations. And then we want to make sure we're addressing permanence, which is really a critical factor for sequestration-based projects. Then we also define the boundaries for project reporting, both physical and in terms of the pools, the sources, sinks, and reservoirs that we're looking at, and the gases that we're looking at for project accounting. And then a really critical part, obviously, is quantification. And a key part of that is figuring out what baselines should be and how to quantify baselines. And then from there, quantifying the actual climate benefits that a project is bringing. And then lastly, we have monitoring, reporting, and verification, which is basically making sure everything is being reported appropriately and the verifiers are able to go out and check and have guidance for how they're actually supposed to check to make sure projects are adhering by the standards that are set forth in the protocol. As far as the overall timeline for this protocol, we had the kickoff meeting obviously back in August, and we are starting with the work group process really in earnest today with this first meeting. We are planning to have at least one more meeting, likely in January, and then potentially a third meeting as well. It just kind of all depends on how the drafting goes and the type of feedback that we're getting, and if we're finding that we need to make more significant changes or there are particular issues that need to just be considered in more depth before we're able to come to a final decision on them. We see all of that wrapping up at least by the end of February, so we can have a public comment period in March and April. And then we would hope to bring the protocol to our board so they can consider it for adoption in June. So I've noted here that there's just a possibility of actually accelerating this whole process, again, just depending on how the drafting goes and the issues that arise as we're drafting. It could be sped up. We have a board meeting that is likely going to be in April, so there's a possibility that we might be able to bring it then to the board. But our focus here is really making sure we have a robust and really well thought out protocol, and we don't want to rush things. So if we need to, we will definitely take the time and make sure we have a really solid protocol that we can bring to our board in June. And just to kind of show the timeline in a slightly different format, again, so we have the first work group meeting in November here. We're going to be drafting over the next several months, and then we'll have the second work group meeting in January, and if necessary, we'll have a third work group meeting in February. We'll be doing a lot of drafting throughout this whole period of time, bringing it all the way through to the public comment period in April and March. When we get the feedback, any feedback from public comments, we'll consider that and respond to those comments and make any revisions that we see fit to the protocol. And then we will deliver it to our board, who will have some time to deliberate over it before it's brought to the board meeting and they're able to discuss it and hopefully adopt it at that point. And that will be in June. In terms of the roles that we're expecting for this process, at the reserve, the staff are going to be, we're going to be managing the overall process of developing the protocol. Again, we'll be holding 2 or 3 meetings with the work group. We're going to figure out which topics we're hoping to get feedback from you all on and bring that to you. And then we'll produce a draft of the protocol for you to review as well. And that will be the focus of hopefully the next work group meeting. And then based on feedback that we're getting from you, we will make revisions to the protocol. And hopefully we'll have a nice polished protocol at the end. In terms of you as work group members, we're hoping that you'll be able to attend all of the work groups, all of the work group meetings. Obviously, we recognize this is a large group. We're very fortunate that all of you were able to attend today. It's really great turnout, but we recognize also that scheduling is always a challenge for a group this size. So hopefully you'll be able to participate as much as possible in those meetings, and hopefully you'll be able to participate actively as well, responding to the issues that we're bringing forth, as well as bringing any other issues that you would like to bring to the table. And that's both before and after the meetings that we would like to get input from you. And then again, we want you to review a full draft of the protocol at the end of the day and provide written comments to that draft of the protocol. So again, this is kind of a lot more of the same thing, you know, holding meetings. For today, we have highlighted specific questions that we want to have addressed during this meeting. We've highlighted those in red, so you'll see that throughout the slides today, and we'll be trying to get your comments on those particular items. But again, pretty much everything is on the table at this point. We're looking for general guidance to help us figure out the basic direction that we want to take with a lot of the concepts in the protocol. And hopefully your feedback today will help us to do so. Okay, so getting into the kind of a higher level view of what we're looking at for this protocol. Just in terms of the basic system eligibility that we're talking about, we're looking at the biochar system from feedstocks, bringing the feedstocks to where biochar is being produced and looking at the technology and the processes used for the development of biochar. And then we're also looking at the fate of that biochar in terms of the end uses and where that's being applied after it's produced. I wanted to highlight here that really what we're focusing on with our protocols is standardization and project efficiency. We try to make things as standardized as possible to bring down costs for projects, both in terms of project development as well as verification. The more we can standardize things, the more smoothly all of that effort tends to go. And I also wanted just to note that while we're trying to make the protocol as flexible as possible to include as many possible setups in terms of the feedstocks and the production technologies and the end uses, we also recognize that this is a growing field. There are new technologies that are emerging, new end uses that are emerging as well. So we can't really expect to be able to capture everything that's out there. So we'll do our best, but inevitably with all of our protocols, we release them, and within a few months, we were getting feedback that despite our best efforts to encompass as much as possible in the protocols, we find out that someone is doing something a slightly different way that we hadn't thought about or the work group hadn't thought about, and so we have to figure out if there are adjustments that we need to make to the protocol. So just knowing going in that we're going to do the best that we can to be as flexible and capture as much as possible. We also recognize that we just simply aren't going to be able to capture everything that's out there, especially in the biochar world, because we know it's a very varied space and only becoming more and more varied over time. Another key aspect of the approach that we're looking at is just what needs to be in place for monitoring, reporting, and verification. And one key component of that is just documenting the chain of custody of the biomass that's moving through these systems, being able to track where it's coming from, where it's being produced, and then where it's ending up. And that includes being able to characterize the feedstocks so that we're sure that it is meeting all the eligibility requirements, and same thing for the end uses as well. And then there's going to be a certain amount of data collection that's going on, mainly focused around the amount of biochar that's being produced, as well as figuring out how to estimate the recalcitrance of the carbon in the biochar. And then lastly, verification is always a critical factor for our protocols, figuring out exactly what needs to be done to verify that the projects are adhering by the standards and requirements that are set out in the protocol. And with our protocols, they typically include a site visit. That's something we are hoping to discuss with you all, whether or not that's actually required for this protocol. But typically we do have site visits included as part of verification. Okay, so now we can actually get into some of the discussion around particular considerations for protocol components. So again, this is just a list of things that we're going to be looking at today. We obviously already went through it, so I'll just kind of skip through. And we'll start with eligibility, and we're going to start with the project definition. So again, we're looking at the system of biochar that encompasses both the feedstock, bringing the feedstock to the gate or wherever the biochar is being produced, the process and the technology used for the production of biochar, and then we're also looking at the end use. And the basic definition that we're starting with here is just the conversion of a sustainably sourced waste biomass material into biochar, which can be used in soil and non-soil applications to facilitate the long-term sequestration of carbon. This is very much a starting point. We realize this is going to change over time, depending on what is actually included in the protocol, particularly in terms of end uses and GHGs that we might be able to account for under this protocol. But we feel like this is a good starting point, at least for a project definition. And if anyone has any comments at any point, please do feel free to speak up. Or if there is ongoing discussion and you're having a hard time getting a word in, feel free to raise your hand or just mention something in the chat box, and we can make sure you're able to say what you'd like to. So as a part of the project definition, we want to be able to define what types of feedstocks we're really talking about within these systems. And again, so our focus is really going to be, the intent is to focus on waste biomass sources. So biomass that just typically wouldn't have any other sort of economic use. And that's going to be converted into biochar. And so there's just an example list here. Obviously, there's a lot more that could be included. A couple of things that we wanted to highlight in particular for feedback was including animal manure and sewage sludge. I know that has been included in other biochar offset related efforts out there. I'm just wondering if there are any special considerations that any of you think we need to make for those particularly in terms of, I guess, impacts beyond the greenhouse gas impacts, if there are environmental risks associated with either of them, either in their production or in their end use. So I kind of open it up at this time for any comments around that.
And John, we do have a question from Jonathan Elcock. Is there the possibility of extending the scope of feedstocks to non-waste biomass, such as short rotation managed forests? And has there been thought given to developing a modular style protocol to enable new technologies and processes to be added on?
In terms of non-waste biomass, I think our hope was to focus at least initially on waste biomass sources, just because when we open it up to other non-waste sources, the baselines become more difficult. There are challenges around leakage that start becoming really complex. And I think it's something that we would like to consider eventually, but I think for this first go around with the protocol, the initial version of it at least, our hope was to focus mainly on the waste biomass sources.
John, from my perspective, I'm looking for a keyword like mill residues. So not sure how that aligns with your top line, like no economic use. So a mill residue, like a byproduct chip, can have some economic value, but also can not have economic value, and it's sort of a market condition. I know that as a project developer, it is those mill residues that I'm looking for.
Yeah, Kevin?
Yeah, do we have some sort of a hand raise functionality in this? I'm trying to find it.
Yeah, I don't know that we do.
Okay. So we'll just try to manage. I come from a life cycle assessment background, and these kinds of questions about what is a waste, what is a residue, are ones that can get pretty sticky pretty quickly. And we might want to come to some sort of overarching definition, and it could be that that definition just hinges on economic value. Because the question of mill residue is a good one. If there's currently a use case, but biochar is a higher and better use from a climate standpoint or an economic standpoint, then do we necessarily want to exclude that? And furthermore, sort of on the opposite side, there's plenty of people who are doing forest stand management, for which I don't know if we could call it a timber harvest residue if I'm cutting down whole tan oak because I'm trying to reestablish a conifer stand, and there's no market for that tan oak, but it's a whole tree. So, these are the kinds of use cases or circumstances that are almost definitely going to come up. And so we just, as much as possible, it's worth having an overarching definition that isn't, picking, isn't saying we have to decide in each specific case or we have to make a pre-decision for every single possible residue type, because that's never going to be possible.
Yeah, I agree, Kevin. I think the example I'm thinking of is, we've got some marginal land up in Canada here where we could, it's not very productive land, but we can plant it with short rotation trees, harvest those trees every 5 years or 6 years, 7 years, put them through pyrolysis, develop a biochar, and then the trees regrow. And it's that short rotation. You're effectively taking the carbon out of the atmosphere. It's additional, right? Because that land is not productive otherwise. Sequestering it in the biochar, and it's an additional thing, but it's not necessarily a waste biomass per se. Its only economical value is in the biochar production. So, that's where I'm coming from. Just a bit of background for that question.
I do have an input. Oh, go ahead, Nathaniel.
Just a quick comment on that. I think I work for the Forest Service for the research and development branch of the Forest Service, and because the issue of waste is framed as an economic issue, one thing we might look at is disposal cost as a benchmark for whether or not something's a waste or a byproduct or a co-product. And I think Jonah's right. In some places, those mill residues are a waste product because the net cost of transporting them exceeds the value once they're delivered. And so in other places, those mill byproducts have good economic uses. And so, in my world, I think waste products are defined by disposal costs, and byproducts are defined by break even or slight revenues, marginal revenues.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. Here in Quebec, there's quite some use for waste biomass, from the forestry industry, and so it's difficult to say that there's no economic use because someone might just be ready to buy it for $5 a ton. So it still has a value, but what you would take out of it as biochar and the climate value surpasses by far its value in other types of application. I do also have an input on animal manure and sewage sludge. I think that animal manure and sewage sludge is not right now considered by the other protocols. And I think that there's still fixed carbon in there. It's something that I think could, yield a large volumes in terms of offset. There's producers out there that could increase that availability for these offsets. So it's interesting, and sewage sludge is becoming a really big problem for municipalities and cities to treat, and a lot of them are looking into pyrolysis and gasification. And these systems are relatively, they're relatively expensive, but they're also struggling with PFAS and a lot of these contaminants. So I think it could be a really interesting option to include them, animal manure in both sewage sludge, given that there's little use and problems for treatment. And in the case of animal manure, we've seen a lot of leaching that is causing issues on the West Coast, in Maryland, Chesapeake Bay, for example. So that's just my 2 cents.
Evan, I really appreciated your comment around the stickiness of the feedstocks in versus feedstocks out issue. And I think it's probably going to merit more time than really exists today. Nate, your description of does it have or not have a disposal value, I think is a reasonable sort of bright line to create, but sometimes that's wrapped up in a transport cost. And so you don't even know you have a cost, but it's transport and loading, which gets confused as is or is not disposal, because transport can cost more or less than the material itself. And also markets actually are changing all the time. For example, right now in the Pacific Northwest, the value of a dry fiber ton mill residue might be something like $20, whereas 12 months ago it was something like $65. And that's because of plants opening and closing based off of broader macroeconomics. And I'm sorry, just one more anecdote. I've had a situation before where I've placed equipment on the ground because a mill had too many chips. I used up all the chips and they started charging me for them. And I said, why are you charging me? They said, we don't have any chips left. And I said, I used them all. So, I mean, from my perspective, most simply, mill residues and increasing the market for mill residues is a good thing for industrial ecology. And it's certainly a tricky thing to define, and we have to get it right. And I don't know what right means.
Great. Thanks, Jonah. So is it defining, trying to label something as waste, something that it sounds like maybe we should try to get away from, or at least defining that in a particular way, in a broader way?
I don't know that that's what I would suggest. I think that just coming up with a more catch-all definition of what are qualified feedstocks. I might push back a little bit on the case that was being made for like a short rotation woody coppice. While there are certainly circumstances where that kind of process may, provide climate benefit, I'm not going to doubt that in any way. You end up with sort of indirect land use change issues, and granted, you're talking about marginal lands, but then we are faced with questions that have dogged life cycle accounting for bioenergy systems for decades now on, well, how do we define marginal lands and how do we make sure that it only comes from these kinds of circumstances and that we're not displacing others? So I would sort of shy away from that and look specifically to wastes and residues. And fortunately, we're not the first group that has tried to knock our heads against this problem of how do we define wastes and residues. So I think it's a matter of going out, looking at other protocols that have developed. Roundtable on Sustainable Biomaterials is one that I'm quite familiar with and has its process for defining wastes and residues. So I don't know where Forest Stewardship Council stands on this for purposes of forest biomass. I think that we can leverage the work that's being done and try to harmonize across a variety of different groups like this one, trying to wrestle with these problems in definition of a qualifying feedstock.
Josiah, I would concur with that, Kevin. Thanks for that. Thanks for those words.
Great, thanks. Okay, and then I guess, Melissa, you had touched on the animal manure and sewage sludge. Just one thought that I had there too was whether that might be something we should consider for eligibility, but figure out if there are limited end uses to be eligible as a total project configuration in terms of trying to prevent any sort of adverse environmental impacts from applications of biochar made from those feedstocks. I think that's something we might consider.
Maybe one from the experiences and reviews that we have done for the VCS methodology, we looked at sewage sludge as well, and we found that there's the ability to certify this against the current biochar standards that at least we looked at in Europe at the EBC was still limited. So that was kind of a problem. Also, we saw that the application from sewage sludge on soils apparently remains debated at least. And I'm not really sure how this would turn out if we put sewage sludge through a pyrolysis process, at least in Northern America. So this might be something to keep an eye out. And I think the third point, which would be relevant, is phosphorus reclamation rates for sewage sludge. I know that this is going to be a huge topic, and this has also some spillover effects. So one of the eligibility criteria, if sewage sludge would be included, would be, from my perspective, to add in that phosphorus should be reclaimed before it's being pyrolyzed, or that it's being maintained in the biochar product and then added to the soil if eligible. So it's kind of a green light, red light system in between.
Yeah. Great, thanks.
I wanted to jump in on the biosolids issue of being called sewage sludge, but it really more is a biosolids from the wastewater treatment plants. Its use in agriculture is very limited. We're beginning to get experience now at a large facility under construction in Southern California in a place called Rialto by a firm named Energia. And they're having difficulty in meeting any kind of biochar standard for use in soil. So they're producing a pyrolysis material, but I think it's really difficult to combine it into the protocol that we're looking at here in terms of natural climate solutions.
Yeah, I guess what I'm wondering is if there are potential non-soil applications where there wouldn't be the risk of those kinds of impacts.
That's what I was thinking, John, because soils is one thing, but at the end of the day, we can sequester carbon in other ways than in soils. I know that, biosolids, animal manure, digestate biochars that will result from its pyrolysis are really high in ash. So they have, they of course will concentrate heavy metals. So it's not necessarily good for soils, and that's probably why you guys are seeing these failures to, get into certifications. But we also can think of applications like in cement. I know some people are starting to really look at, those materials for cement and concrete usage, because you're sequestering the carbon, but you're also limiting the contaminants, the heavy metals from leaching anywhere. So I think there are some cases to include it, but maybe it's just simply more touchy and more difficult to draw a line for those materials. And I would also add, anaerobic digestion digestates. Sometimes they are from animal manure, but sometimes they are from food waste, as an example. So that's something that is generally less contaminated in terms of heavy metals and such products. So maybe we could also add this to the debate.
Sure.
And Sean, we do have a comment from Rachel. I see the benefits of keeping feedstocks broad, and I can see manure as truly a waste product that also has soil health and water quality benefits, for instance, turning soluble phosphorus into insoluble phosphorus. But there is a lot of subjectivity on the alternative disposal pathway and associated avoided emissions. Would it be anaerobically digested, composted, or applied as fertilizer if not for being turned into biochar? This burden would fall on verifiers.
Yeah, that's a good point, is getting to the baseline scenario for some of these materials. And we'll be getting into that a little bit more later too. So that might be something that we're able to circle back on as a part of this discussion. Okay, maybe just to keep things moving here, let's look at the bottom of this slide here, and just in terms of establishing sustainability standards for materials, for forest-based biomass, we're looking at third-party certification or having some sort of state sanctioned management plan, or if there are instances like in California where there are fuel management waivers that can be given, being able to show something like that, or potentially just having a professional forester essentially attest that the feedstock from the forest was being sustainably harvested. And then on the ag side of things, a lot of other efforts are simply specifying that a certain percentage of the residues are left on site to prevent any sort of soil carbon impacts, or having significant soil carbon impacts, I should say. I think that's our plan, is to incorporate these similar sorts of standards for sustainability for feedstocks. But again, if anyone has any thoughts on any of those in particular, please speak up.
John, again, I'm going back to mill residues. So my first idea here is I wouldn't want to breathe so broad that it risks the protocol, right? I'd rather see a protocol happen without issues. But in my case, I have round wood coming into mills, and then, you know, the slab edges and the end cuts are non-merchantable. Those go through a chipping process, and those become feedstock for char. And that may or may not be a certified wood product, but it's waste material at the mill. So, and it would be extremely difficult to go upstream and have, you know, say a company like Warehouse or whatever, you know, pull certified feedstock only to go into that stream. Not quite sure how to deal with that, because our feedstocks are just a small component of that mill residue stream. So you can change the upstream sourcing.
Yeah, I think the intent with this, and I obviously didn't make it very clear here, but so this wouldn't be addressing mill residues necessarily. It'd be addressing things, biomass that's coming directly out of the forest and being processed in the biochar. So the timber harvest residues and fuel treatments, or some sort of forest health treatments that are being done with non-merchantable material.
So sorry, just clarifying, if material was a waste material, so the source is like a chip form versus a whole tree, you don't need SFI chip. You just have to say it's waste material.
Yeah. Okay, if there aren't any additional comments, then we can move on to the next slide. And we're still talking about feedstocks here. So again, just the initial intent here was that we're not going to be including purpose-grown biomass, largely again because there are just a lot of challenges around that on the accounting side and eligibility side, and in particular leakage is something that we know is a big issue that we would have to figure out there. So our intent was not to focus on that initially, but maybe consider it in an update to the protocol eventually. And then not including municipal solid waste, with the exceptions being, you know, urban green waste that we would include. And then similar to other standards, having limits on contaminants that can be in the feedstocks as well as dilutants. And so the main question I put here was just if there are any other specific limits or exclusions that we should include for feedstocks that should not be eligible under the protocol. And I think we've talked about a few things already in terms of things we may or may not consider, but if there's anything else at this point, happy to have any comments on that. Otherwise, we can continue on.
Can I ask a question about this? Not necessarily a comment. So Vera's protocol also doesn't allow more than 10% diluents, and they didn't say why. And so I'm just curious, like I asked them in my comment, like why do they allow additives to begin with? And how does it, you know, support, I guess, the goal of climate mitigation? And then how is bias in calculating the carbon sequestration avoided, you know, when you have diluents?
Yeah, that's a good question. Maybe Hannes, if you're if you're able to respond to that, since you're involved.
Sorry, I'm having some problem with my connection. Could you repeat the question quickly?
Oh, my question
Yes.
was on the diluents or dilutants criteria, which Vera's protocol also had the same requirement and didn't elaborate on why we're allowing dilutants, and then how we're avoiding any bias issues with calculating the net climate benefit.
We took this requirement from one of the EBC standard requirements, but I can send the feedback back to you in the aftermath of that.
Yeah, and I think that's part of what we were looking at too, is just the aligning with some of the other standards that are out there in terms of IBI and EBC. If we're able to align with those standards, it will likely make project development and verification more efficient.
Yeah,
I did
go ahead.
Oops. I just wanted to mention that in the draft protocol of Vera, I think that they said they wouldn't allow mixes of feedstocks. That's something that I think we should definitely accept, because a lot of biochar producers actually mix their feedstocks. Some of them might have some green wood, some of them might have some forestry wood, and they mix it together for humidity purposes, for other technical purposes, and sometimes just to actually hit the volume that they require to run their system. So I don't know if that is what was meant here by diluents, but I think that's something that we shouldn't go away from, having several feedstocks. We should characterize those feedstocks, but in a single plant, we should accept multiple feedstocks if it is run simultaneously.
I completely agree with Melissa on that.
Yeah, that sounds good. Just quick on the diluents. For instance, diluents can be the soil that's scooped up when you scoop up some wood chips, and so the climate benefits you would capture, because you measure how much carbon is in your wood chips, and if there's a little bit soil in there, but if this definition holds, then it cannot be more than 10%, but a little bit is in there, then that doesn't matter. It's just the carbon content is diluted by 10%, and the biochar will also be diluted by 10%. So you capture it on both ends, and soil is a common example of when you scoop up wood chips, for instance.
Right. Thanks.
So I think that's important, that it kind of helps show that there's a difference, because some people might have considered that to be a contamination and be contaminated with soil. Whereas I think it's important to recognize that I think that's what the diluents and dilutants is capturing, is kind of the soil that might get in there, as well as in some cases adding particular types of soil to your feedstock, or things of that nature can actually improve the quality of that product for certain end uses. So that would also be something like a diluent, maybe intentionally added at the early stage. And I think the 2% contaminants, I'm imagining that means, it's slightly different than the diluents, in that could be, plastics or some unintended product that ends up in there, such as nails in the wood or things of that nature. So maybe Jonathan, Remicall, if you could touch on the definition of contaminants, I think that might be useful.
Yeah, I think generally, I mean, those are things that I believe are defined by the IBI and EBC standards, but generally, I think those are pointing, if I'm recalling correctly, they're pointing towards like hazardous materials or heavy metals or things like that.
How are you going to separate out heavy metals from what's been absorbed from the trees or the feedstock itself versus, something that may have been part of the process? Or is that even worth addressing?
The concentration are so small if it actually comes from the tree, that I don't think it's really worth addressing. And yeah, the IBI, they run the test.
Yeah, maybe. I think in a lot of situations, that's absolutely true. It just depends on where the feedstock is coming from.
Yeah, one way ask a question about is whether that is captured then in the product composition. Here at the feedstock composition, it might be overkill to do it in both because it has to be done anyways for biochar. So then one would capture whether a certain threshold was not met in terms of heavy metals or arsenic or anything else you can imagine. I think that probably makes more sense than putting constraints on feedstock composition in terms of heavy metals and so on, because when we get to pathogens and microplastics and hormones and whatever that are also regulated, they of course change on conversion, and heavy metals also will enrich on conversion. So exactly. There will be a lot of change from feedstock to biochar, and maybe that would facilitate it at having a constraint only once.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Likely more efficient testing at the end of the line too.
Maybe we also, again, on the question on mixing of the feedstocks and the requirements of the feedstock purity, if you want to say that. I agree with what Johannes Lehmann said, basically, because we in the VCS, we put higher constraints or requirements on the feedstocks because we also had the option of including non-tested biochar as a sink. So, and I think there's a difference. So if you work in a small scale operation where you don't have regular testing of the end product, then you have to obviously put a higher requirement in front, which makes it impossible to mix feedstocks, because in that case you have different carbon contents depending on the mix you throw in the beginning. But if there's a requirement to regular measure the output carbon content and characteristics of the biochar end product, then I think you can ease a lot on the feedstock type side.
No, that makes sense. Thanks, Hannes. Great. Any other thoughts or comments before we move on? We'll move on.
Just a quick question. Would that add a lot of cost, Hannes, to do that type of testing, do you know, or anybody?
On costs, I think there are biochar producers on that round here which are much more elaborate on that, but I think also in terms of depending on the end use that you're applying to, you have to do the testing anyways. So for example, in order to get the EBC certificate, you have to apply regular testing, which is aligned to their certification.
But it can get expensive. No, that's cheap.
I spend about $300 to $500 a month in testing with Soil Control Lab, and I get 2 or 3 tests a month, and that gives me a carbon content, particle size distribution, ash, moisture. It's that standard test, So we might create that test as a function of tons produced. That way, folks who are larger, the more you make, the more you test, and it's pretty logical. Scalable by size.
Mm-hmm.
I definitely agree with Jonah. I think it's a good idea because a lot of smaller producers then won't necessarily have the margins or even just the cash flow sometimes to get all these tested. And the tests are also not inclusive of the actual certification itself. So the test at the IBI doesn't include the certification by the IBI. So that's something else I think we have to address in either requesting a test or certification.
Yep.
If I could, if the main goal of the testing is to determine the carbon component of the biochar, what is the alternative?
If I could chime in here, you have your more, for instance, with EBC, you have a multi-tiered, what do you call it? Levels. If you're going to feed the char to animals, well, then this is the most stringent. If you're going to use this in building materials, well, this is the least stringent. And I see this as, okay, number one, let's analyze for carbon stability, and that's fairly inexpensive. So long as you're able to provide a representative so long as you're able to reduce whatever's coming out of your pyrolyzer into a 1 milligram representative subsample, or take enough of those subsamples and analyze enough of those. So that's, that's roughly $20 for carbon stability. No big deal. Some of the other analyses, if you're going to feed the stuff to animals, well, then there's the more expensive, like PAH, PCB, dioxin furan, and you can easily throw $700 at that suite of analyses. And I think that's where testing frequency also comes in. I mean, if you're able to guarantee that you have homogeneous feedstock and you have homogeneous production conditions, well, then your char will also be homogeneous, and then you can scale back on your testing frequency. Sorry, I digress. I don't even remember what I was chiming in about. Yep, I'll just stop.
That's really helpful. I was asking, if the point of the main point of the testing is to determine carbon content, what is the alternative? But your point is really helpful, is that, there's different levels of testing, and to just determine carbon content, it might not be that much of a financial burden. But I appreciate the point about not wanting to exclude small scale producers. I think that's important. I'm just trying to understand how else we can get to, what is credit yield if it's not through that testing.
I mean, there are default values depending on the feedstock type from the IPCC, and this is what we've used as a default fallback for VCS if there's no testing option. Obviously, this will not be very attractive because they are conservative, but I think the aim that methodology should go for is set testing as a standard, and then if absolutely no option is there, then there's a fallback, which is kind of linked to a penalty deduction for the crediting.
Yeah, and I guess that's a question I would have too, is whether there are issues around practicality for doing the testing or getting the samples from smaller scale operations. Maybe they're out in the forest and have some sort of mobile operations. If it's more of a challenge to get samples that are reliable under situations like that, or if that really wouldn't be too much of a problem at all.
I think it depends on frequency, right? So I don't really have the sense of what the team would think is a regular frequency, but as just an example, I'm part of a team managing approximately 1 million tons of wood fiber in North America a year, not necessarily for biochar. Most of it is not for biochar. But everywhere from the woods to the plant gate, we're pulling samples, and we're pulling samples 3 to 5 times a day just for our own ability to operate. So it's very feasible to grab samples. I think the question is, how often do we have to grab them and what size? And I wouldn't feel qualified to address that. I don't know if someone else could talk about what's reasonable sampling.
I think it really depends on the actual facility. If it's someone who is always producing, as someone earlier brought up, with the same feedstock, the same, parameters, it's, unless there is a change, we could just assume on good faith that, once a year, a sample from, 3 different days should be fine. I mean, I'm just throwing these numbers out there. They don't have to be exactly these numbers. But for mobile units that was brought up, there is very little control over temperature. There is little control on, well, the feedstock itself. You get bark, you get, hardwood, you get softwood. And if there's a lot of bark and a lot of sand because they picked up the bottom, you won't have at all the same amount of carbon in the biochar. So I think I agree with Hans that there should be some not some penalties, but some buffer or a reduced ratio, if I could say. The number, I don't know, but in terms of testing, I know that a lot of the biochar producers that we work with get theirs tested either monthly if they're larger or quarterly if they're a little smaller. So I do think it should be on the size, but doing it monthly for a small producer is a lot. It's going to be expensive for them. Of course, everything depends on what we qualify as small. But
I think just a quick comment on process. There may be two issues we want to untangle here. One is what qualifies as biochar and what standards we use and how frequently tests need to occur to meet the standard that we're developing. And then the other is end use and what types of properties meet different types of end use needs in terms of heavy metals or these other characteristics. And I don't think we'll be able to capture all the testing that would be required over certain types of end users to validate the quality of the char that they're using, but we may want to stay in that middle ground, informed obviously by end use requirements, but not kind of shackled to them in terms of the discussion of what would these people have to do to meet this protocol. And then leave the testing that's associated with validating product quality for their customers to the business.
I agree. Some use are regulated. You know, you can't just put anything in the soil, so that doesn't fall on the Climate Action Reserve to actually monitor that.
Right.
I can't help but feel that we're somewhat recreating the IPI standards in all the conversations we're having right here. So I'm just wondering, Akio or Johannes, if you want to shed any light on some of the current efforts, if there are any, for like version 2 of the IBI standards, and or the potential to utilize the EDC standards that have been updated recently.
So I'll chime in on this one. I went through a thorough review of the IBI standards, and frankly, I think it's stuck in committee at the moment. So I can't speak to what forward movement is going to be. But with regards to Climate Action Reserve, it could be as simple as specifying, yes, so long as your char is certified by IBI or EBC, you know, let those organizations, they've put the time in to develop their standards, so you might as well just rely on that. And you know, as regards the thresholds that are employed by the two standards, they're fairly similar. If anything, you know, you could take it one step further and say, you know, biochar must comply. For instance, let me take a step back. So for heavy metals, for instance, IBI provides this range, you know, from so many to so many milligrams per kilogram in the biochar, and that's, you know, that's only so useful because this is based on, you know, regulatory agencies across the world. And so instead, Climate Action Reserve piece could state something like, you know, so long as you're complying with the compost board, your local compost board or something like that for materials that are added in soils, and you're using methodologies that are stated by IBI or EBC, A-OK. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and if I can chime in, I think Akio is exactly right that, and that was said just a few minutes ago, that local jurisdictions will always supersede those global frameworks. And EBC is a regional framework, and they have slightly different numbers because the EU has slightly different numbers than the EPA and the Australian EPA and other jurisdictions. And they were only looking at the most stringent jurisdictions within the EU. And that's where most of the differences come from originally, apart from a few others. So I think it serves as a global general framework, but then there are local limits on what you can put to a soil that, of course, needs to be considered. And then none of these cover really anything but soil.
Yeah, and I would add too, just to this particular conversation, that as a part of our protocols, we do require regulatory compliance by any project activities. So that would be kind of encapsulated in terms of complying with any local or relevant jurisdictional regulations and laws.
It does feel like a large part of this conversation drifted from feedstock testing to char testing. I'm not sure if we were clearly delineating between the two, and I was probably a bad actor in that. But I think a lot of this testing should shift to the char side, where you're testing less material for more information.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And it might have been, you know, I might have just put this in the wrong place in the slide deck. So, but yeah, I appreciate the idea of bringing this to the testing of the char itself instead of testing of the feedstocks. I think that makes a lot of sense. And you know, that's fine for our conversation to move around quite a bit too. We've actually covered a couple of topics that were big ones that are coming up. So that's totally fine. We by taking the time now, we're able to kind of make up for that time that I was expecting for us to spend later. So you know, wherever this conversation takes us is great. It's good to get the feedback, and it's great that we're having the discussions that we're having. So please don't hesitate to bring the discussion where you see fit. Okay, so let's move to the production technology side and conditions. So again, we want to try to make the protocol as flexible as possible to accommodate existing technologies as well as ones that are emerging. And so I guess the main question here is if we need to identify specific technologies or conditions that should not be eligible under the protocol, whether they have some sort of higher greenhouse gas impact, where they just wouldn't provide a benefit, or it's unknown what the impact would be, or if there are other reasons why certain production processes shouldn't be allowed under the protocol.
This is a question for people who know the chemistry better than I do, but are we including technologies that might produce carbon condensates, you know, like carbon black and those sorts of things? And then also one that comes to mind is the hydrochar, hydrothermal upgrading and the hydrochar stuff. I don't know enough about technologies that have those carbon outputs and how well they fit into this framework.
In terms of carbon black, that is a no, because we are focused on biomasses. I don't think we should accept anything related to tires or plastic. There are a lot of people asking for it, but maybe that could be, you know, a future amendment to the protocol. But it gets into a lot of complexities because it's not simply bio. And in terms of the hydrochar, that's also something that popped into my mind. The properties of hydrochar are quite different than the properties of biochar, but we can still measure the fixed carbon. In many circumstances, hydrochar will actually be a byproduct of a hydrothermal process that is destined to making another product, most often liquids. So I don't see it necessarily as a problem, but I do think we have to have a mechanism such as energy allocation, for example, to actually account for the emissions that are being allocated to the char production rather than to the main product, as an example.
So you don't see it as something that necessarily would need to be excluded from this? It could potentially be included if we're able to get the accounting right.
Yeah, I think so.
Well,
again, the properties are different, but the fixed carbon is still fixed carbon, and that's what we rely on. There's going to be a lot of volatiles. There is scientific literature though that says that, you know, the measured fixed carbon is not necessarily as stable in a biochar as it is a hydrochar. So if you really want to avoid all potential complexities, we could put away hydrochar. But a lot of people will come up with projects and say that their hydrochar is in fact biochar.
Melissa, could you comment on the H to C org molar ratio as a measure of carbon stability in hydrochars? Because I was under the impression that if we use that metric to measure carbon stability, then hydrochars would be excluded.
Yes, I've actually did that quite recently, and you're right. It goes a little bit over, but then again, we have to account for organic carbon. And as I said, how can I say this? The H to C and the O to C ratios are high because there's a lot of volatiles in those chars. But if we're able, and this is maybe something for Johannes that knows a lot more of the characterization than myself, but if we're able to find literature or methodology, or if that exists already, that characterizes a stable carbon in a hydrochar as really a similar stable carbon as in a biochar made in pyrolysis, then I don't think we will have a problem. But if we go along with the IBC, which requires those HC and OC ratio, I think for some categorization, it might exclude it.
Yeah, it probably will if we go with the metrics that you mentioned. I don't know whether there are some genuinely fused aromatic ring structures that have cluster sizes that would by themselves be large enough to be persistent in the soil in hydrochar and should be allowed under this scheme. But in general, the H to C or O to C ratios are so high that it would fall naturally out of the definition of biochar that is used in any of the other accounting schemes or any of the guidelines. So one would need to not to exclude the technology, just use the common definitions and it would fall naturally out of it.
Likewise for torrefaction.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or for something that's just not really charring, slightly toasting between torrefaction and bio. I mean, there's a sliding scale, and or just not very well charred, or something went wrong, then it will fall out naturally.
Yeah, I think again here the IPCC model that they have, the table that they have in the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory is pretty useful. They just have two categories, and that's pyrolysis and gasification. And I think pyrolysis and incomplete combustion and torrefaction are all just part of a spectrum. Turn up the temperature and torrefaction becomes pyrolysis. If the combustion is incomplete enough, at what point is it pyrolysis, and at what point is it incomplete combustion? It just depends on how much air, because pyrolysis never has zero air. There's usually some, and it's kind of a sliding scale. Whereas gasification does have some unique characteristics, and so I think following the IPCC pathway, they just kind of have two categories there for pyrolysis and gasification as being distinct. And then other than that, it's just captured by the feedstock and the temperature, feedstock and temperature, and then emissions. So rather than predetermining using some sort of layman's terms here, sorry, not you, Johannes, but some sort of informal terms here for the technologies, I think it's important to block it in by the experience. Because you can have a combustion system where some of that feedstock experiences pyrolysis. So what is that, combustion or pyrolysis? So I think that it's important to look at the temperature and the emissions and have those as being much stronger than any sort of title that we give it. So that as newer technologies come on that might be vague as to which one they are, we can box them in according to the temperature and the emissions, particularly the emissions. Those are just some thoughts.
Yeah, no, that I think that all makes sense, Josiah. And then it becomes a question: is the method using material properties? And then it really doesn't matter what you call what's on the front end. Or is it using some kind of measure of production conditions, as the IPCC appendix does? It only uses temperature and words such as gasification and pyrolysis, and then you need to say something about what you're using, what conversion method you're using, because otherwise, no, you don't know what you have. And that is really, so that's why I think production technologies hang together with the decision of what is monitored. And I don't have a conclusion to this, but you know that IPCC method used temperature in its recommendation because it's national accounting and it's easier and quicker to do that on a national scale. But the new US national greenhouse gas accounting guidebook that is in review at the moment will use material properties, H2C org ratio, because we assume that it will be it provides a more rigorous assessment, and it gets around having a conversation, what do you call that conversion technology, because it really doesn't matter.
That's a great point, Johannes. Great point that I think it's important to delineate between the material analysis and then the box of technology. I think that's right. Going towards the material analysis as the primary is going to be more accurate, which is going to be advantageous. And I think as Hannes mentioned earlier, it is useful, I think, to have a fallback for smaller producers that may not have the ability to measure with such accuracy the material characteristics. And that fallback could come with somewhat of a conservative penalty. And that fallback could basically be the IPCC table, something of that nature.
Thanks for that. And I think that is something that was one question that I had later on too, around quantification and monitoring. So it's great that we're able to cover that, because that was kind of exactly what I was going to pose, was whether focusing on the HC org, we definitely want to do that, but wondering if we could have some sort of kind of fallback standard, as you were saying, Josiah. So I think that kind of captures that discussion I was hoping to have later. Okay, so I think we can move on from this slide at least, and move on just to the definition for end uses. And again, we're looking for end uses where we have some sort of assurances as to the permanence of the carbon that's being sequestered. Again, we want to provide as much flexibility as we can while still having those assurances. There will likely be some uses that just simply aren't allowed because of eligibility requirements, whether those are the regulatory compliance requirements or environmental safeguards, if we build any into the protocol outside of regulatory requirements. But again, it's kind of a similar question to the production technologies. I'm wondering if there are any specific end uses that we should just say categorically are not allowed. And just as an example of that is using biochar as a way to produce energy, since that is obviously releasing the carbon back into the atmosphere. That's not a really beneficial use for climate purposes. So if there are any other uses kind of similar to that or dissimilar to that even that we should not include under this protocol, it'd be great to hear about any of those.
I don't know that we need to flag things Well, I guess it depends on how detailed the carbon accounting is going to be for the protocol, but I don't know that you necessarily need to flag things like, for example, you said energy uses of biochar. Well, I don't think we need to flag that because there's not going to be a carbon sequestration then, and so it wouldn't qualify because there's no carbon sequestered. I mean, I suppose you could have some energy produced in your biochar manufacture, but the biochar, the carbon sequestered in the biochar would still be counted as sequestered. So my concern would be more, are we stimulating activities that are otherwise environmentally problematic, not from a climate standpoint per se, but somehow environmentally or socially detrimental in a way that you don't want to attach the Climate Action Reserve name to. But I don't know that you need to call things out because of their carbon footprint, because if their carbon footprint is such that it's not providing a sequestration, then it's not going to qualify anyway.
I think that there's likely a period of time where biochar for fuel switching is a carbon sequestration beneficial move, but to attach it to this protocol could be very detrimental just from people getting upset perspective, and it might be beneficial to restrict it in the language to just avoid that type of challenge.
Yeah, I think it's really important. I think it's really important to just say it loud and clear. You know, if the carbon that we've just produced and then measured is then after consumed, it cannot be considered. And so, for an instance, we have clients asking to utilize our biochar for purposes that would result in its consumption, burning it straight as a coal replacement, or even utilizing it in the production of green hydrogen, which would consume the carbon in that material. Those are consumptive processes that would negate everything we've done in this. And so I think it is important to go ahead and just specify that, even though it might be redundant, but just go ahead and specify that in the report or in the protocol.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I do think it's redundant, but I don't think there's a downside, and there could be an upside from an optics perspective to just making it clear that those things don't qualify.
Yeah. Although I specifically don't like the word consumption, because I think that animal feed will be a significant market.
Yeah, and that's where I was going. Maybe a different term. I know that we all think that it's recalcitrant and it's going to go straight through the animal, but for the layman, you see that word consumption and you automatically think you're going to eat it, and therefore it's going to go away.
Okay, combustively oxidized or something.
It doesn't, but it wouldn't have to necessarily be combustively oxidized, you know, rapidly oxidized, rapidly released, something.
Yeah, something.
So is the next
something that degrades the stable carbon.
Right.
But I think we also have to talk about activation markets.
Is the next tier down from this? Is the next tier down from this short-lived consumer products, and maybe activated carbon fits into that? I'm just trying to the energy aspects of this I understand, and whatever we call it, whether it's consumption or oxidation. But is the next lowest tier short-lived consumer products that may or may not end up in a landfill?
I think that the fate of that short-lived consumer product is critical. If it ends up in a landfill that is guaranteed to not be burned or in any way is stable for the next 100 years or something, okay, fine. But if it ends up potentially in an incinerator, then that would, of course, negate that. So I think with a short-lived consumer product, there is a lot of problem in being able to determine exactly what the end life is of that.
I think that brings a question of tracking, because a lot of people will say, some producers will say, I'm supplying this biochar as a filtration media, and then there's going to be a second life to it. Okay, what is the second life? Because it is within that 100-year time frame. Do we implement a tracking system? Do we ask for mandatory reporting of those second lives? I think that you know, the activation and the short-lived consumer product brings us to this question.
Now that's a good problem to talk about, and obviously these mean residence times, or the amount remaining after X number of years, usually 100, pertains to application to soil and nothing else at the moment. That doesn't mean one can't develop something for something else. I think there's EBC, when stuck into cement, they say it's 100%. There will nothing be oxidized because there are no microorganisms in the middle of a cement concrete block. So there it's they consider it permanent. They don't say there's 30% lost over 100 years. But then you still need to prove that it ended up in a concrete block or in the soil. So that step has to still happen. And then the question is that what this method also wants to do? Say, here are a couple of things, or a list of things that you can do with this method, and then there's a certain F-perm, or the fraction that is permanent attached to it. If it ends up in a concrete block, it's 100%. If it ends up in soil, then you have to look at what the property of the biochar is, and then it can be this and that and the other. Or it's done differently. It just excludes some, and there are generic calculators in there. I don't know. That's a good discussion to have.
I think a good question would be if it's an opt-in or an opt-out option. So if you want to, before we had the discussion to ban certain uses, and then you have it gets very detailed, or if you say it's an for any end-use typology, you have to add certain key informations, which can be lifecycle assessment. And then each project proponent who wants to apply this methodology for a specific end use has to make sure the necessary information are delivered in terms of permanence and in terms of degradation factor. And if those are available, then and they tick all the boxes, it's an eligible N type. And if those information are not delivered, then it's not an N type. And this would be more of an opt-in option, where the methodology would also be a bit more open in terms of what kind of specific end users there are. And that would spare us probably a couple of hours to go through a list of eligible end use types or not.
I have a question for people who are actually producing biochar. My question is, does the end use of that biochar that you sell, well, one, do you know that end use? And two, does that end use tend to change fairly often, or does it tend to be the same end use the whole time?
We like to think we know what happens. I'm not sure we do. And does it change? Yes.
I think when there's a price tag on knowing what happens to that biochar, the level of attention dramatically increases. And so there is certain situations where a producer might be willing to just let the material go out into some vast, unknowable retail chain because they'll pay a high dollar for it. But in other cases, they're going to be highly prioritized or highly incentivized to only allow the biochar to go out into known pathways, because knowing those pathways can result in getting a carbon credit. And so I think it's a little bit of, it would be a little bit misleading to look at history as a perfect predictor of future when there's a new factor involved. And as a company that's now registering carbon credits in a system that requires the end user to sign off on that end use for every batch we produce, I can tell you that it's something we pay a lot of attention to. And it causes shifts in prioritizing our clientele.
From a verification standpoint, what's the level of traceability of that? In other words, you have a record of where it went, but and I guess this is going to be part of the discussion down the line, but maybe that's going to be what's the expectation on the verifier as well. But what kind of assurance do you have that once it goes out for your records, it went a certain direction and you know where you sold it, but that end use was how it was applied?
I think that's probably John Remical. You probably have a slide further for the registration and verification parts. So I think I'm guessing that's going to be a question that we'll be able to address probably more in detail at that time. And I think we did shift a little bit, I think, from some really interesting discussion about this gray area. I think we're all kind of that when the biochar is applied to soil, it's pretty straightforward. This is very well researched. There's a lot of robust information for us to rely on here. When the biochar is laid down in concrete, that looks pretty well done. When we're going to burn it as a charcoal alternative, wow, that's a pretty clear no. But then that gray area in between, of potentially a short-lived consumer product, and figuring out what we can or can't do about that area. I think we were touching on some cool stuff there, and I don't know if we've really, before we move on, I thought that was an interesting area of conversation that maybe we should try and tidy up.
Thanks.
Yeah, and we will be touching on the verification stuff later, but obviously we kind of moved in that direction a little bit. In terms of the kind of that gray area that you're talking about, Josiah, from a protocol and registry standpoint, we want to maintain a conservative stance. So if we don't have assurances that as to the fate, the ultimate fate of the biochar, some sort of reasonable assurance, then we would have to take a conservative stance and either not include it or have some sort of conservative emissions factor associated with it, or discounting factor. So I think with some of these things, there might be some categorical exclusions that we might need to include, but other things, maybe there's some discounting that we can apply, so that some of these end uses could be used.
Would it be possible to put a little bit of a placeholder there for that area that could be improved upon in later versions of the protocol?
I think so. I'm not sure I know exactly what you're meaning, but
I mean, I think it's an important area, but I don't know if we can sufficiently get it right, in the time that we have. I think it's an important area, but it's perhaps something that would need further development and or a little bit of testing the model and input to get it just right. And perhaps we could put a little bit of a placeholder that says conditional, like a conditional category on that area.
One thing I would suggest for, using biochar, and, some people use it filtration and reactivation, I would, if you want to stay out of, if you want to take a safe stance, I would put away activation as an application and reactivation, just because you're going to lose a lot of that carbon. So that's just my idea.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that could be extended to all post pyrolysis manufacturing techniques. What's the mass loss associated with manufacturing? And that keeps us away from end use disposal discussions, but for like biochar in a toothpaste or deodorant or something like that. But if there's a post pyrolysis manufacturing process like activation or some other process that includes significant mass loss, that's kind of a red flag.
I do want to precise on activation. If activation is done on site, say it's a producer that also has an activation facility on site and it's their own and they can measure it, then they can actually measure the carbon at the end of this process. So this shouldn't be so much of an issue, because we will have a life cycle that includes, the post processing, as you mentioned. If it is sent to someone else for activation, this is where we have an issue, because there is no control or no necessarily much confidence that the reported emissions are going to be right, and that these entities don't really have anything to prove to us. So And in terms of post-processing, kind of falls into my idea, Nathaniel, to answer your question. If it's on site, it should be included in the LCA. Some people, you will remove ash. If you have an ash removal, like some producers do, and that's actually consuming energy, then it should be included in the LCA. And the end product should be the one that is after the removed ash. That's the one that should be measured in terms of carbon and then also in terms of volumes produced. That's how I see it anyways.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. It's all about defining, percent yield from starting feedstock. And once we're no longer able to do that, we're in trouble. And if we're doing that well, we're getting it right.
Okay, great.
Quick question to everyone, because we had some discussions before on livestock feed, and I know it's very intuitive to say the biochar will remain stable. Do we actually have proof of the carbon content that it remains stable when put through a cow? Because that would reference a bit to the fact, John, that you mentioned before in terms of being conservative. And
But
we had that
also
discussion before.
Especially since cows have, 4 stomachs, there's a whole lot of biochemistry going on in there. Has anyone done that research? Has anyone seen that literature? I have not.
And that was a bit the constraint that we also had with construction materials, because also there we kind of felt that there's nothing happening in concrete, but because everyone feels the same way, no one is researching it, so we don't have a proof of that assumption. But John, this is probably something that you, as the reserve, should need to address on how you feel with this levels of uncertainty there.
Yeah, I think that's right. Because if we don't have assurances, we'd have to either figure out if there's some sort of discounting that's applied, for inclusion in concrete. That might be something we'd have to look just kind of at the full life cycle for building materials and figure out the longevity of buildings, what the risk is of a building being, what the lifetime for a building is, if that concrete could somehow be broken down and the carbon somehow released. I don't know if that's really a risk or not, but I guess that's something that we might have to think about. So I think your point's well taken, Hannes.
Yeah, I think it's important to consider maybe a buffer or something like that. But I really want to highlight that these problems are problems that were encountered 10 years ago with the IBI, and there's just not enough research. But the goal of generating carbon offsets for biochar is to actually get the market to scale up. So if we become too restrictive, then we're actually preventing that scaling up into different types of applications that could be beneficial. So I'm not saying we should include them all or we shouldn't include them all. I just think there's a consideration, and we have to, keep in mind what is the final goal.
Yeah, I think with the animal feed, I think that's such an important group there, particularly because of the potential greenhouse gas emission reduction of utilizing biochar in that pathway. I think it would be incredibly disadvantageous to solving climate change if we were to restrict biochar from being used in animal feed. So I would suggest that it would be good for us to maybe look at supporting evidence, but also to try and see if we can find the opposite. Is there any evidence that biochar is not stable through that system? I think you could, without having to do that live in a live animal, I think it would be reasonable enough to look at the proxies of biochar stability withstanding certain acidic conditions or biological conditions representative of a cow's stomach, which I think there is a lot of evidence showing that biochar stands up to the conditions similar to a cow's stomach.
My guess is that this has been studied and we just need to go to the literature on it. There's enough people in the sort of, between the climate folks and the husbandry folks who are interested in this, that that I think we can find literature. My instinct is we just err on the side of caution, and we err on the side of we don't count sequestration unless we are tracking a product to its final resting place. And a cow's stomach is effectively its final resting place unless there's some sort of a incinerator system that this particular farm has employed for its manure. Even if there's a digester that they're using for their manure, that biochar is going to run right through the digester. So I wouldn't be too concerned about that. We just need to track it to its ultimate end use. If its end use is activated charcoal that's going into some filtration product, then I don't think we can say that we've tracked it to its end, because then there is an end of life for that product. And unless you have some manufacturer that is then recollecting their filtration, which we can expect for battery manufacturers, but not for activated charcoal manufacturers, I don't think that we can claim that we have tracked it to end of life. So that then means that we maybe foreclose on some potentially economically attractive use cases for biochar, but we also prevent adding to the economic attractiveness of other use cases where there isn't actually sequestration. So it's, you choose your economics. Are you credited for the carbon sequestration, or are you using the biochar in its most economic use, which may then not lead to carbon sequestration? And if it's the latter, then you don't get the credit for the former. I think that seems to me to be the erring on the side of caution approach.
Yeah, and that kind of just highlights some, one of the things that I mentioned towards the start of this all was that we want to be as flexible as possible, but we also know that we can't include everything in the protocol. So there are just going to be some situations that you're not going to be able to get carbon credits for what you're doing. So as much as we try to be as inclusive as possible, we just can't include every single situation. Okay, I'd like to move on to just the next topic, which is project ownership. And just a simple definition that we're looking for essentially is who is able to be issued the credits. The most likely choices we're looking at are the feedstock provider, the biochar producer, or the end user. And what we are likely going to include is just having the biochar producer as the default owner of projects, because they have the control over where they're getting their feedstocks from. They obviously control the production of the biochar and the process that's involved. And then they have control over who they're selling their materials to as well. With other protocols, we do allow for cases where the project owner isn't necessarily the default. They just have to show that they have some sort of agreement with the default owner that they are able to be issued credits instead of the default case. So that's likely what we would be doing here as well.
Yeah, I think if there's a contract for someone to offtake the biochar, as there are in several cases, and that the right to the biochar and its inherent, carbon attributes, then the person who is issued the credit should probably be that person who is offtaking the biochar.
Yeah, and part of this comes back to verification as well, because if you are, say, the end user of the biochar, you need to still be able to produce all the documentation and the evidence required for the quantification aspects of this for this protocol. And if part of that requirement involves sampling of the biochar at the production site, then it might be more problematic for the end user to be able to do that, or they would have to just have the cooperation of the producer to be able to produce the necessary information.
If the producer is not involved, it's going to be extremely difficult to get the data even to write an LCA. So.
Yep. Okay, and this last point here on this slide kind of gets to the next topic, which is just aggregation. And this is the idea that you're able to combine what would otherwise be thought of as individual projects into one larger project. And we try to provide this option mainly for smaller producers. We have examples of this in our forest protocol, in our grasslands protocol, in our soil enrichment protocol as well. And it seems like this should be something we would be able to allow as an option under this protocol. But in order to maintain some of the efficiencies that we would like for project reporting and verification, it seems like there might have to be some limits on the conditions under which projects would be able to aggregate. So whether that is geography, or if they just have similar project configurations in terms of the feedstocks that they're using, the production technology, or the end uses. I think maybe end uses is a little bit more flexible. I'm not as sure about feedstocks and production, if there's as much flexibility around that in terms of aggregating projects, but that's the hope, is that we would be able to allow some form of aggregation under this protocol.
I consider this a very important topic from my perspective, so that we don't bias this whole system to large producers, that there are ways to aggregate that we can figure out that are appropriate to the whole carbon development, but that we don't bias this whole system toward the big guys as opposed to the broader structure of what we can accomplish if we're smart about it.
Great, thanks, David. Yeah, so I don't know if anyone has any thoughts around this. If not, that's fine. It's something also that we can just think of over time, and it might be something that we put into language to propose as a part of our initial draft, and we can get feedback from you on that at that point.
I think it's a good idea to be able to aggregate projects. I think it's interesting for smaller producers from an economic perspective, because they don't have the means necessarily to pay for an expensive LCA when, you know, they just have a small production, yet they are still contributing to sequestering carbon. I don't think it should necessarily be in terms of geography. I do think it should be more in terms of feedstock and technology and parameters used, because that's where you'll see the, you know, CO2 leaks. Geography, whether it's a project on the West Coast or on the East and in the East Coast, if they have the exact same thing, if they're using, you know, green waste from cities, if they're producing with the same technology at same temperatures and have a really similar biochar, I don't see why they couldn't be aggregated, even if they're separated by 5,000 kilometers in miles. I don't know.
I'd be happy to participate in a smaller work group of this larger team if others were interested to grapple with this issue of what's the right approach to aggregation of these smaller systems, so that we can keep them in the game, but also make it workable.
And it seems like the
Sorry.
Go ahead, Allison. Sorry, you go ahead.
I would be happy to be part of that as well, because I agree with you 100%. It's, you know, if we can get more power behind the little guys, then I think that it makes the most sense, since all of this is regional.
Absolutely. This to me is a very important topic of not biasing this whole system to the big guy. It's very important that we offer an opportunity to pull this piece together. It's not easy, obviously, and we're going to miss some pieces, but having a work group on this could be really useful.
And it seems like in terms of aggregation, that really what should be the driver for parameterizing that is linked to what Melissa was saying, is why are we aggregating projects? It's to reduce the transaction costs for small producers, and some things reduce the transaction costs, and geography is not necessarily one of them. But if you're aggregating 5 producers and all 5 of them have different products and processes, and all 5 of them have to do different LCAs, that seems to be defeating the purpose of aggregation. So Yeah, aggregating according to factors that achieve the objective of driving down the transaction costs makes sense to me. Aggregating according to factors that have nothing to do with the purpose of aggregation don't seem to make sense to me. So I'll just throw that out there. And I think geography is a good example. If you're using the same feedstocks in the same process for the same product in different locations, it seems obvious you could aggregate that. But if you're in the same location, but you're using wildly different feedstocks and processes, the geography doesn't add up there to aggregate.
I do think geography is worth including in the considerations, because geography does come into play with the feedstock and the regulatory landscape that it's coming from, and then the end use and the regulatory landscape it's going into. So I do think geography is an important consideration, but should not necessarily be a block. As exactly how you define that, I don't know, but I do think it's an important consideration. I think it's also worth considering that aggregate projects wouldn't necessarily always be a small owner, that you could potentially have a very large effort that is combined, but has very small nodes of production. So incredibly small production, mobile production, I would imagine, out in the fields or in the forests, but under a large concerted effort, I think would be an important thing to consider in an aggregation methodology.
I think you're going to be dealing with minimum scale as well. We don't want this to be just a few pounds here and a few pounds there. The transaction costs would overwhelm. So we have to have some minimum scale, but some way to aggregate is, to me, very, very important.
Putting my project developer hat on, working for South Pole, I definitely would encourage an aggregation, because otherwise I don't go forward with a small scale plant if I have to register it individually. That's just too much work for me. And then thinking of how I would proceed with that is, to me, the question is now, what kind of parameters would be changing in the final methodology? So I would postpone that discussion actually to the end. So for example, if we've resolved the feedstock discussion and we figured out that we don't really care about how the feedstock composition is because we do the testing afterwards, then we can rule out an aggregation according to the feedstocks. So I think now the question is, and I think I hear consensus, selfishly proclaiming that aggregation is kind of necessary. And from there on, I think now let's go forward and afterwards figure out what kind of those parameters we should use for aggregating actually or not.
Yeah, and I go back to a lot of my work years ago on general permits, permit by rule in the air quality field, and also some degree in water quality, where there were standards built that kept the costs on the transaction side within reason by allowing for general permitting, that you met a certain standard and you certify. And maybe I'm hoping we can build something in the aggregation field here that keeps transaction costs under control while bringing the little and the mid-sized guys into the game.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so it sounds like there's good consensus that we do want to build in aggregation. As I said, that is something that we do want to do at the reserve as well. So I'm happy to set up a smaller subcommittee potentially to examine this and have some more discussions on the side, just so we can really hammer out some of these details and make sure we're getting things right, or at least as right as possible. So that's great. I appreciate the comments from everyone.
Sorry, John, could I just, I was just thinking about aggregation in a slightly different way, and this might be a bit of a curveball. I haven't quite thought it through fully. But I was thinking on the lines of a larger operation that's producing a lot of biochar, but maybe it's got a lot of different end uses. Maybe it's going to different end uses. I don't know if you would necessarily call that aggregation, but you're kind of, and I guess it depends on the final setup of the protocol, whether we're looking at the production or we're looking at the end use as the primary driver for the quantification. But I just wanted to throw that out there as a comment more than anything, that maybe aggregation could be looked at in more than one way in this protocol.
Yeah, and then part of that might boil down to who's the owner of the project. So it might be just a single owner of a project that has a large operation and has multiple end uses. And so that would just be considered a single project, whereas what we typically think of for aggregation is having what would otherwise be multiple project owners, or they might, depending on how we structure the aggregation requirements, there might be individual project owners that are coming together to report as an aggregate under the protocol. So I think there are multiple configurations that that will be allowed under the protocol. It's just kind of figuring out all the details.
And keeping the transaction costs under control while achieving the results we're looking for. That's the crossover point I'm looking for.
Yeah, great. Okay, if we can keep moving to, I see that we're under an hour left, and just given the level of discussion, I think we'll just keep moving through. So the next topics, if I can get the slides to advance, we have start date and crediting period. You know, these are just kind of general definitions that we have to work with at the moment. And we'll be kind of figuring out if these need to be modified at all. But in terms of the start date, we're just talking about the date that the production of biochar starts, for which the credit issuance is sought. There are other options in terms of having just like the first date that the date that the project is submitted for listing. I think it makes more sense to tie it to the actual production of biochar in this sense, in this case. And then for crediting periods, we have other examples of protocols that have 10-year crediting periods that are renewable up to 2 times. So you could end up having 30 years total that you're reporting for a project. Whether or not 10 years is the number we want to land on in the end, it might have to do with additionality concerns, whether you could actually argue that your baseline is valid for a 10-year period. But at least at this point, that's what we're proposing for the initial reporting period length. Or sorry, the crediting period length. And then in terms of reporting periods, so when you're actually, the period of time for which you are seeking to have credits issued for the activities that are taking place under the project. We want to have some flexibility here. With some of our protocols, we allow for, you know, you can essentially report for a range of times, but we typically have a maximum of 12 months as a limit for an individual reporting period. So if you wanted to, you could report for just several months of activity if you have enough to warrant doing so and going through any sort of reporting and potentially verification process.
Hey, John, sorry, quick question there. Would you have to verify, imagine if you do it quarterly, every 3 months you do the reporting, would you have to do a verification for those 3 months, or would all the past verification that you've done, all the LC that you've completed, everything, would that count for the minting of the credits?
Yeah, in order to have the credits issued, you would have to go through verification.
So if we were talking about doing quarterly reporting periods, we would have to do 4 verifications a year?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, so obviously that's not going to be really practical for a lot of projects probably, but if you have a high volume project, that could be an option that you might want to employ.
Okay, okay.
Right. Okay, and then
wait, hold on, going back on that. I think that is, I didn't have any questions, and now I do, brought up by Patricio. So we would be, I'm just kind of going through this. We would register the facility, the production. We would establish the production, and then after that, we would be verifying batches of biochar produced, measured in truckloads or periods or whatever. And then we can account for and register these batches and all the material that we've moved on a monthly or quarterly basis. Would we have to basically re-verify the entire production process every time we register a batch? Or can we be registering batches on an ongoing basis and re-verify the facility annually?
Yeah, that's a good question.
That's more where I was headed as well, yeah. But
yeah, I mean, there might be some efficiencies that we could build in. if you're able to provide, evidence that you aren't changing the processes that are involved, or at least having some sort of significant change. So if you do want to, maybe there could be some sort of a verification that's more focused on documentation and not necessarily all the high-level details that might otherwise be required on an annual verification. It kind of maybe depends on exactly what we require for verification in the end, I would imagine.
John, the most important thing here, I think, is like the process of how biochar is produced. So if that process doesn't change, then I don't know if there should be a continuous verification, because the process is the same during the whole year. So the output is going to be the same, and it's going to be a lot of time and money spent if you want to be able to, mint credits on a quarterly basis. I think there would be it would make no sense, and you would just roll it to do a yearly verification.
Mm-hmm.
And not minting those credits for an entire year is a heck of a lot of working capital that I don't want to have to hold on to.
A lot of working capital.
That would just tie up our business. That would make business very difficult to run, because we'd be incurring costs all year long on that production, and that's just a huge amount of debt and working capital. That would be really, really difficult. And so I think that, I think it would be really important to be able to have the facility and process verified annually. Or if you're beyond a certain threshold of production, maybe you have to do it even less. Maybe if you're really, really, really high production, you got to do it semi-annually or even quarterly. But within certain range, you just have to do an annual verification of your process and your facility. And other than that, you have your batches that you're producing throughout the year. And you can register those batches without having to re-verify the entire facility. That would be much more useful from a business perspective if we could do it invoicing monthly or minting credits monthly or quarterly.
I agree. It's really tough on cash flow, and biochar producers are not known to have a lot of cash flow. I was thinking that, to reduce the risk of actually doing a verification every quarter, if that's what we wanted, we could instead issue those credits as Patricio and Josiah have, suggested, but keep a buffer for the yearly issuance, so that if there are any issues, if there were too many credits issued, we have this buffer that we could remove from, kind of as a risk mitigation.
And that could be on a yearly basis, of course, yeah.
John, is that something that would the reserve allow ex ante? I guess it wouldn't be ex ante, it would be reported consistently, it just wouldn't be verified. You know what I'm saying here, because normally you look at a forest project and there's no ex ante credit, it's all ex post, and the same for all the other project types. But would that be considered ex ante crediting or ex post if they were to be issued credits prior to verification?
Yeah, I think in order to issue credits, we would have to have some form of verification. So my mind kind of goes to what we do with the forest protocol, where we have the option for projects to undergo, a full site verification that's really intensive, that's reviewing the inventory in the forest and a lot of the details that you might not normally have to do on a year-to-year basis, because you can rely on some other calculations. And so for those, you have those full verifications that are required at least every 6 years, and then in the interim years, you can report information just based on what you have, and it still has to go through some form of verification, but it's a desktop verification. They're not going on site and doing something as intensive as the verifications that occur every 6 years. So that might be something we could consider for this as well, if there's some sort of intermediate verification that can be done, less than annually. That still requires some sort of documentation and a review by a verifier to make sure that everything that's being reported is reasonable and all of the documentation is in order, and then rely on those annual verifications to do something more intensive. So that's something that we could probably bring in, but I don't think we could just go through and not have any sort of verification and issue credits in that way.
So with something like an Excel spreadsheet with reported either sales or production, depending on how the producer reports it, sent to the verifier quarterly would work. Would that be enough with, you know, some examples of invoice? To what extent does this interim verification is going to be demanding for producers?
Yeah, that's a question. I mean, I think we would try to minimize what's required to the extent possible, but we still have to have assurances that what's serving as the basis for any credit issuance is backed up by you know, any necessary documentation.
But wouldn't that assurance be the process of production? Because if that process remains stable, then there's no different outcome to the biochar. You know what I mean? If you're able to verify that that process stays the same in a constant, the product is going to be the same if you don't move anything at the beginning of the production.
Sure, yeah, but so that would be probably something that's more focused, more the focus of the annual verification, whereas something in the interim would be focused more on the amount of and evidence around the amount of biochar that was produced, as well as the end uses, and then the feedstock sourcing as well. So just kind of providing all of the necessary information that goes into the calculations and some of the eligibility requirements. Whatever could be covered by that kind of documentation, I think we might be able to accept for some sort of interim verification in credit issuance.
Just to quickly add another layer of complexity, now that we have different end users and some of those end users might not be credible, how would that interrelate with the reporting period of the batch production? So that would mean that for every batch, you also need to report the use case. Maybe Josiah, you have a good experience.
Yeah. So we're a great test, test case here because we're registering credits for biochar right now in California, and we verify the facility on an annual basis. And it's a fairly intensive, looking at the whole process, everything in, everything out, emissions, qualities, electric use, the whole kit and caboodle. And then after the major annual, our batches are reported essentially with weight tags showing the quantity of biochar, weight tags along with moisture content, so that we know you have a weight tag showing how much you got, and the moisture content showing how much of it is water. And then also the farmer sign off. I say farmer sign off, it's the end use sign off. It's primarily farmers that sign off that, yes, this material was applied at this location in this purpose. No, it was not used, it was not burned, and no, I won't double count it. So we have to show, I'm sorry, the other element there, weight tag, moisture content, distance of transportation, and farmer sign off. And that's our batches. And we basically do it truckload by truckload. And then we can congregate batches into, 15, 20, 100 truckloads or whatever, each with their corresponding information. I don't know if that's useful, but that's what we're doing right now.
Josiah, what program, can I ask? Just because it seems like there'd be great analogous pieces from an existing verification process to draw from, just for my education to understand moving forward. Is it a BCS, or you're getting verified annually? So.
Yeah, so that's with Carbon Future is the platform we're using there, and they're using the EBC Carbon Sink guidelines, and then the company that's the third-party verification on that just changed their name, and I don't remember the third-party verification's name at this point.
Okay.
So that's the system we're using right now, and we're also working with Puro, but we don't have active auditing with them for biochar delivered yet.
Great, thank you.
It's extremely complex for biochar producers, but I think as CAR is wanting to put together a standard that is, of higher quality, it is something that we could reasonably put into place. Similar, not necessarily the same, because Carbon Future utilized their own blockchain technology, but
this discussion certainly fits the larger producers. As we get back into the aggregation concept, we're going to have to find other mechanisms. I found in permitting and permit by rule issues that the analogy to tax filing in the 1040 works, where you essentially accept information provided by the small generator, small producer, and then verify periodically with penalties for lying, cheating, and other misbehavior.
We could also obligate to a certain extent, make it an eligibility criteria that the producers, part of this methodology, are required on their invoices, on the invoices and the receipts they send to the buyers, to state that if the buyer is buying, then they consent and they take responsibility for the use of this biochar in a non-combustion or non-CO2 releasing manner. So that way we bypass the whole, asking every single consumer to report, because that is complex. And for a lot of biochar producers, they sell one bag there, one bag there, one bag there. It's tremendous amount of data to collect.
It is, and the plural,
even commercial, where we're actually putting the biochar right back into the soil near the point of production. So you can have certain kinds of self-certification of that if it's not even sold. The
right.
game, get carbon in the ground, and yes, there has to be sales on the commercial level, but in projects that are funded by grants, for example, we're ending up just doing soil sequestration. So a self-certification can cover some of that.
I think projects that are funded by a grant is another topic that we should discuss too, perhaps at another time.
Yep. Okay.
Distance to end use is really tricky. And Josiah, it sounds like you're selling direct to many end users, which is quite trackable, but I'm not sure as the market grows, certainly in my case, that's not what I see. I see a transaction and I know the end use, but I might not know the final destination.
Right. And so in that case, this is solvable. Basically, it's so the plural methodology, they kind of have an audit process. So they'll basically do an invoice auditing, and so you have to be able to show with reasonable level of confidence the end use. And if there's not sufficient confidence, it's not accepted. So yes, I think that's a solvable problem, and I think the Carbon Future platform, requiring end use signature is one of the strictest kind of scenarios, and I do believe that they have also developed their system to accommodate for situations where the producer, the registrar, is selling to somebody that is then selling again. And you basically pass that, it kind of gets passed on. That you do have to have some sort of sign off on it, but you're able to kind of anonymize that without having to communicate directly with the end user, if that makes any sense.
From my understanding of the Carbon Future methodology, the blockchain that they've put in place for volumes that fall around, I think it's one big bag, then a distributor could be considered as the end user, because even if he splits up that big bag, it's nonsense that someone would buy biochar that's such a high price and burn it. It's just nonsense. It's like when we talk about reversals. But there are a lot of reasons why biochar producers aren't going for the Carbon Future methodology. They're going for the Puro methodology. And that's because of these complexities of tracking their clients. A lot of clients, they don't want to get asked what they're doing with the biochar, even if they're using it in soil. Now, that's something that we should avoid, obviously, but there's also the consideration that Carbon Future is crediting the users rather than the producers. So if the user is, asked to fill out all these information, they're getting credit, that's fine, they're willing to do so, but maybe they won't be willing to do so if that money is going to the producer.
Bottom line, it's got to be traceable. or at least it's got to be accountable. I think, you know, it's a really important part. However we solve it in the climate action reserve version of a biochar accounting methodology. I think there's two important parts in that. One, I think getting back to the crediting period, it needs to be achievable within a timeline that doesn't sink a business. And if we can't basically be minting credits except for annually, that's going to be just really hard. Getting it so that we can be able to mint credits on a shorter timeline, preferably monthly or even less, is going to be highly advantageous to this being successful and adopted. And then also on the assurances side, there needs to be confidence that we're able to, that we know what's happening in the end use. And I don't think that one is particularly straightforward as to exactly how we solve that. I think there are a few models to definitely look at for as a template.
Yep.
We could suggest like random verification. So based on good faith reporting and then random verification, kind of like VCS does in some cases for overall projects.
Right.
Sure. Yep.
And most likely by the third party who's conducting the third party verifier doing the auditing.
Josiah, just asked, do you mean the selection of random would be by the third, excuse me, the third party auditor, or would that be something designated by the reserve or something along those lines?
Yeah, I mean, I think either or, but I think on a regular basis, the producer should be providing ongoing receipts, you know, invoices and all of the accounting, or not accounting, but, you know, the verification that this material is going to these certain end uses, and then the verification organization in collaboration with Climate Action Reserve. I don't know if it has to be one or the other, but third-party verification would come in and randomly audit and follow one of those invoices to the end use and just verify that yes, that actually did happen.
So just a spot check of a select portion of records is what you have in mind.
I would imagine that would be very effective. Yes. I think that's what Melissa was suggesting. I think that's essentially the Puro pathway, that the producer provides information, and their verifier will randomly confirm the information is accurate.
Sorry, can I just ask a quick follow-up question on that? So is the suggestion to issue credits and do some random verification of those credits being issued, or? And I also want to clarify for us on the verification side, we don't do facility level verification, it's project level verification. So yeah, could you clarify the random piece for me a little bit?
I think the random is to be defined by us together in Workgroup. It's kind of an idea that we pitched. We don't have a specific idea. I don't think we necessarily have to go the Puro way. They have their own standards, and the goal for this standard is to be maybe a little bit of higher quality. But I do agree with Josiah that we have to have traceability, and so invoicing and a lot of proof that either the end user has taken responsibility and has, you know, signed that they were not going to use this in a combustion application is the type of documentation that is realistic to obtain for most biochar producers. Keep in mind that some biochar producers have, you know, they sell in person and some people come and pick it up and it just disappear. Maybe they're going to grow, you know, marijuana with it. Maybe they're going to go and put it in their ground. But regardless, we can't track everyone. They don't leave a number necessarily. So having it on the invoice is important.
And just to add to Melissa's point, Holly, I don't think we could add some responsibility to the end client, because I think that would hurt the biochar market. So, no, I think no responsibility should be given at all to the end buyers. They're just props that say like, hey, we are buying the biochar, this is the invoice, everything, but they shouldn't incur any responsibility, because that, I think, would affect the demand for biochar in general.
Okay, my perspective is just that we wouldn't be able to issue credits, to John's earlier point, without verification. And we can definitely be flexible about what that looks like, but we would not be able to do that as a program.
So again, just kind of like physically what that would look like, we would verify the facility and the production parameters, that we have a machine, the machine does this, and we've shown that it's the machine over X months has shown to be consistent and stable in its production. You know, these temperatures, this much energy production, this much energy use, and this emissions profile. You get that, you know, you get that figured out, and then after that, you just have truckloads going out. You're gonna have truckloads and truckloads going out, and you need to be measuring the weight of that truck and some basic characteristics of the biochar, showing that, you know, you're doing random sampling of the biochar and you're showing that the moisture content is, you know, X amount, and that the characteristics are continual or within a range, right? And so then the producer would be reporting every truckload, every weight tag, and the moisture content associated, right? As well as the transportation distance to end use, or at least within a reasonable assessment of that, right? So that's kind of what the ongoing verification, every truckload would be sending in that information. So that's someone on the, and we'd like to be able to verify that, you know, I sent those truckloads out, you know, it's the month of March or something, I sent out 100 truckloads, and I'd like to be able to show that information. You can come verify randomly moisture content or anything on that. And then on the producer, or I mean on the end user side, I can tell you that it's not a static thing here. It's not as though the price of biochar is some static thing. With our end users, some of them don't want to sign off. Some of them want to use the biochar for a purpose that might not be compatible with carbon sequestration. That's fine. They're going to pay a high dollar for that. If they are willing to sign off, then they're going to be able to enjoy the rewards of carbon sequestration offsetting that cost. And it's a big difference, you know. And if they don't want to sign off, if they're not cool with using that biochar in a carbon sequestration pathway, they're welcome to pay, you know, however much money for that. But if they are going to be able to use that in a verifiably carbon sequestered pathway, they can enjoy the discounts associated.
But in that setting, and maybe I would look at the validators here, there's a clear incentive to report false data. Well, that means, like, how can you, and this is a bit my question, to certify the activity of producing and not certifying the activity of applying the biochar. How can you guarantee that there's no false indication from the end user, that there's not a huge biochar burning pile behind the factory where there's a sign off that it's rightfully used?
See, just to weigh in, just because I think it was kind of directed this way. And so from Josiah's point, I very much agree. You know, like I think it was Patricio and Josiah, you're talking about the end user. They basically sign off on it, but that immediately put up a flag in my mind. And keep in mind that, you know, this is a working group to develop the approach, to develop the protocol, to develop the verification approach. But from a verifier standpoint, we kind of implement as what the final product is. The second you say that an end user is signing off, I mean, I'm not intimately involved in the biochar industry, so I don't know from an end user standpoint if the likelihood of the risk of that end product being consumed and then being put back into the atmosphere. But I don't know. I mean, you basically have somebody's signatures on a page. And that would be where our reasonable level of assurance would stop. If you're telling us that we can't go to those end users, I'm not saying we have to, but if we can't go to those end users, we can't be assured of the final destination and result of what's happening with that biochar. So I'm not sure how to find the happy medium between getting assurance that that's actually not being used in some sort of consumable way that's going to put it into a re-release. I don't know if that point, tell me if I'm not anchoring that well enough, but if you just have a signature on a page, you're wholly accepting whatever they said they were going to do. And if they're incentivized to get paid more or get a better price for that product by signing off on that page, there's going to be some bad actors somewhere in the mix, I would expect.
I'd like to just make a couple of points here. On this question of verification, my tendency is to sort of defer to the folks who are professionals in this space, the folks at the reserve, the folks at the verifiers, what kind of chain of custody is necessary in order to ensure, in order to have the relevant assurances in place that, okay, is there open fraud in the system? Possibly. That is to a certain extent an irreducible risk in any market. I don't, and we're going to do the best we can to, to monitor and manage for that. It doesn't seem like a huge risk in this particular market. The money is not that good. There are other things that you could do to defraud people that would be more profitable. And are we going to offset the biochar price so that it's cost negative, so somebody has an incentive to like take on a bunch of biochar that they're going to then just combust in the open, when they could equally have just spread it on agricultural fields and gain some benefit from it in a way that was going to sequester that carbon? It feels like there's some amount of, I don't think we need to go to the nth degree in avoiding these risks. And my tendency is to say, verifiers, folks in the sort of carbon market, tell us what needs to happen on this side of things. And this work group should have more of its attention on the technical and the science side of how do we sort of, account for the carbon and make sure that there isn't carbon leakage, not economic leakage from the system. I also have another issue that I would like to just put raise in this meeting before we run out of time. I don't want to derail this conversation, so maybe I'll just, sort of step back, let this finish out, and then just sort of point to something else that I would like us to discuss, if not on this call, at least soon.
Hey everyone, this is Heather from the Reserve. I just wanted to build on what Kevin just said. I feel like we have a lot of programmatic requirements and rules surrounding verification that we will have to stick with. There's only so much flexibility that we will have with verification in general. So I just wanted to throw that out there, that what Josiah was describing with facility level verification, I feel like that would be part of, if you're going to do quarterly verification or annual or every 6 months, that would just be part of that verification bundle. Like a verifier would look at all of those different things at the same time that they're verifying the quantification of the actual reductions. So I feel like that's what we've seen so far with, shorter time frame verifications. Also, that does get pretty expensive. I think we've only seen really large industrial projects do greater than annual verification. So cost of verification could be a huge factor. And I know we've been discussing, ways to cut down those costs, but that's just something I feel like as the Reserve, we've been really conservative with third-party verification, quality of credits, affecting costs of those credits. So we would just have to be very careful about all those things and thinking about, flexibility around this with the biochar protocol. So I just wanted to throw that out there too, that we can only be so flexible based on our programmatic requirements. And I definitely agree with Kevin that it's really good to nail down like the scientific and technical nature of this protocol with this work group too, and then think about like flexible options for verification. So I wanted to put that out there, since we work on, I work with Holly on a bunch of like the big industrial projects and, landfill projects and organic waste composting. We have to do like really detailed waste stream tracking with ODS, ozone depleting substances. We do really detailed chain of custody documentation reviews, and verifiers have to do that. So I feel like with biochar, we will probably be, pretty detailed on the tracking that we require for these projects. I may be off there, John, but that's my general take from the type of these projects. So I guess we'll just have to see how this pans out. But I just wanted to speak up on the verification piece, because we see a lot of variability in the program, but I think there's only so many different things we can do to be flexible.
I want to be sensitive to what Heather is saying. As a former EPA enforcement officer, I understand these issues historically. On the other hand, I'm seeing an increasing amount of California work where we're actually not selling the biochar, we're creating it in forest and doing in forest sequestration. And I don't want to preclude that from the protocol if at all possible. And some flexibility or new interpretations of verification are going to be essential, both for aggregation and for in-forest use, which is not a commercial sale at all. It's simply using something like the Tiger Cat carbonator. We're looking at projects that can be thousands of tons in the next 2 years that won't be sold at all, or most of it won't be commercially sold. It will be placed into the soil by the generator of the material. So I'm hoping we can accommodate that in our approach while sensitive to what Heather's saying about the verification process.
Is this something that can be sorted out through kind of a risk assessment during this methodology development process? In other words, for end users and end use, from a risk standpoint, you don't want a verifier probably to come in and every single project say, well, what are all the multitude of possible end uses and what are the risks? Because you're going to get a lot of variability. Certain verifiers are going to have different opinions. But if this is something that can be vetted during the process of methodology development, then maybe it's determined that there isn't a high risk of that product going to some consumable use that's going to get it released. And it can basically be vetted that, because folks from the reserve, the validation verification guidance documents you guys put out are pretty prescriptive, or at least constructurally prescriptive, so that we can see this is the level of detail, and it might be such that an attestation is acceptable just because the risk of it going to some sort of consumable use is low. I don't know if that's helpful, but it seems like that might head off a lot of uncertainty and additional effort on the back end.
I think that's very helpful. That what we're looking at two different kind of risks that we have to balance here. There's the risk of cheating and getting some cash through a credit through cheating. There's also a risk of not getting enough carbon into the ground. And what we want to do in a group like this, I believe, is to balance those two risks appropriately. We want to maximize carbon sequestration while minimizing financial cheating. Neither one is going to reach perfect.
I concur. I think what you've suggested, Sean, sounds very smart. I think if you were to conduct a risk assessment, the risk that the material would be used in an alternative pathway is actually quite low. It's not that great of a barbecue charcoal generally. That generally it's gonna, once you produce it, it's very stable, and it's the risk of being used in a combustible pathway is relatively low. But I do think there needs to be a system of verification that is viable and also sufficient for confidence in all parties. And I don't know exactly what that looks like, and I look forward to the process.
Yeah,
I agree with everyone. We have to keep the objective in mind, and that's to sequester carbon in a measurable way. There's always going to be risk. In every market that exists, there are cheaters. It's not something that we can just, avoid, but we could assess the risk related to that. I know we don't have a lot of time left, but I just had a quick question about this slide. The start date, the first date that the production of biochar for its credit issuance is sought, is that when the producer applies? Is there a retroactive period? That's something that I think wasn't touched on.
Yeah, typically we say that the start date for projects under our protocols, is in particular under new protocols, can have a 12-month look back period to kind of capture at least some early actors who, obviously, we're developing this protocol. There's a process that takes place. They know we're developing this protocol. So if they're able to collect all the information that they need during that period and provide it, then we allow that. And similarly, looking forward, we usually have the project has to be submitted within a certain time period, and that varies between our protocols. I think it's between 6 months and a year, typically, between when the start date is and when they have to provide, when they have to first list the project with us. So there's a little bit of flexibility around start dates. Okay. Great, and we do have, looks like less than 10 minutes left, and we've only made it through a portion of what I was hoping to talk about today, which is, I mean, that's fine and that's terrific. This has been a really great discussion, and we've actually, even though in terms of the number of slides, there are still quite a few left, we've actually covered a lot of the topics that I was hoping to cover. So maybe what I would propose to do at this point is we might be able to sneak in one more topic and then get to the next steps. But what I think maybe we could do is distribute the slides to the work group members, have you take a look at it and look at the questions that we have on those slides. There might be, I can confer with my colleagues at the reserve and figure out if maybe we do want to hold another meeting sometime relatively soon, just to continue this conversation and round things out. Hopefully we'd be able to do that in maybe a couple of hours. But yeah, we'll have to figure out some next steps because there are a number of topics still to cover that we'd like to get your at least initial feedback on to help guide us in our, as we're crafting the first draft of the protocol. Yeah, Kevin?
Yeah, this is just a topic I wanted to flag for follow-up conversation that, I mean, it's probably in your slide deck, but we didn't get there. I'm concerned about how you propose to account for the counterfactual fate of the residues that are being turned into biochar, in particular, you know, woody biomass. Is it going to be is it going to be subject to a prescribed burn? If not, are we assuming some decay rate that as it sits out in the forest? What about wildfire? I mean, there's a lot of variability across California landscapes, across the nation or the world, around, you know, the counterfactual outcome for these residues, not only sort of what would happen to them, but also, you know, if they are going to sit on the forest floor, the rate at which that carbon is going to be emitted and potentially sequestered in the soil. And I feel like the protocol is missing something if it's not capturing that, if it's making an overarching assumption for residues. And so I'm just curious how you propose to tackle that question.
Yeah, and maybe I can, this is kind of a big topic. So, you know, with 5 minutes left, we probably won't have, or we definitely don't have enough time to talk about it. But that is one of the critical issues that we need to solve with this protocol, and getting work group input on that will be really important. So we might have to table that, and just, I think it would be good to have another meeting relatively soon, just to make sure we're able to cover all these really critical topics before we get drafting at least a lot of the really main parts of the protocol. So I would suggest actually tabling that, but that is definitely something that we want to talk about. So I'm gonna just kind of skip ahead. And Kevin, you can see here that this is one thing that we do want to talk about, is just figuring out how you select your baseline and then being able to quantify those baselines appropriately. So, and figuring out what the appropriate baselines that we can include under this protocol is a really critical issue. So I'm glad you bring that up. That is something that we do want to talk about, and I think that'll be a good discussion for this work group to have. So let's skip ahead to next steps. So you can see there's a lot of slides that were remaining. Again, we did cover a lot of those topics though, fortunately. So we'll regroup internally and figure out exactly how we want to proceed and which topics we still have left to discuss. And depending on that, we'll figure out the exact next steps or the next immediate next steps, I guess. So generally, if you have any feedback on anything that we discussed today, again, I'll distribute the slides so you can look at the rest of the slides too, and you can provide any feedback on that. We will try to figure out a time to hold another meeting sometime soon where we can continue discussing any topics that we weren't able to cover and that we feel like we really want to get work group input on. Generally speaking, anytime that you have any questions or concerns or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out. We are going to start drafting on our side of things, but again, we're looking for some support and direction for some of these topics, so we'll have to hold off on some issues before we can really get into it. And then looking further forward, we will eventually be sharing a draft of the protocol with the work group to get your review and feedback. And hopefully we'll be able to do that, put together that protocol, that draft relatively quickly, since fortunately we have other efforts out there that we're able to use as examples and draw from and craft that we see fit for our own program. And hopefully that will be able to be the focus of what we were considering to be the second meeting in January. But obviously we'll try to have something prior to that to talk about some more of these topics.
Change your date to 2022, I think, yeah?
Oh yeah, sorry, thank you.
But I do like potentially sooner. That went well with that.
Yeah. Yeah, and then just a couple of email addresses for any questions or comments that you might have. I think you all obviously have my email address already in your inboxes. So yeah, and I think with that, we will leave things for today. But again, I want to thank you all for participating. This has been a really terrific discussion. We covered a lot of ground. There's still obviously some ground to cover, but it's really great to hear all of your input and learn from your experiences and from your expertise. So thank you again. We will be in touch shortly for the immediate next steps in terms of scheduling a follow-up meeting to continue this discussion.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Bob.
everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Pleasure. Have a great day, everyone.
Take care.